Welcome to the deep dive. We take your source material, we really dig into it, and pull out the most important insights and knowledge nuggets.
Exactly. We try to cut through the noise, give you the essentials, make these often complex topics clearer and hopefully pretty engaging.
And that's exactly what we're doing today with the history of Romania. You've shared this really comprehensive document. I mean, it covers everything from way back in prehistory right up to modern times. It's integration with Europe.
It really is quite a journey through the millennia, isn't it? It shows a history shaped by, well, a pretty unique geography and this constant interaction with powerful neighbors.
So our mission today is to navigate this rich history, try to nail down those key events, the cultural shifts, the political developments that you really need to understand Romania's complex past and, its present too.
And why Romania? Well, because its story, as you see in this material,
Right.
it's just an incredible example of an identity being forged and enduring under huge pressure from empires. It's a really dramatic path to becoming a modern state and then navigating some rapid, often pretty challenging changes.
It really does offer fascinating perspectives on history itself, on national identity, and just the complexities of being at this major crossroads in Europe. So, yeah, let's unpack this incredible story.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start right at the very beginning, like before written history, in the land that's Romania today. The material paints this picture of a unique landscape, dominated by the Carpathian Mountains and the Danube River.
Yeah, it mentions those ancient chalk cliffs and caves along the Danube. Sounds almost poetic, holding secrets from way back.
And the archaeology that's backed up in the sources, well, it's kind of astonishing. It highlights finding stone tools dating back 500,000 BCE
Wow.
in Oltenia and Muntenia. And the material actually notes this discovery makes Romania the nation known to have the oldest stone tools found in Europe.
500,000 years ago.
Yeah.
That's an incredibly deep human presence, isn't it?
It really is. Then, moving forward, you get Neolithic settlements popping up, like at Tertaria and Turdash. This is the 6th millennium BCE. And these aren't just, basic sites. The sources show a pretty sophisticated early civilization. Polished stone tools, the beginnings of copper and bronze working.
So settled farming, metallurgy, developing really early there.
Exactly. And there are even these unique bronze objects found in Transylvania, dated around 2000 BCE, which kind of hints at specific local contributions to metalworking.
Right. So who are the main people in this region before the big empires like Rome showed up?
Well, the material really focuses on the Dacians. They were an Indo-European speaking people living across this Carpatho-Danube area and known for a surprisingly advanced agricultural economy for the time.
And they weren't just scattered tribes, right? They actually formed a state.
Yes, under a leader named Burebista. The source indicates this Dacian state lasted right up until, well, almost the Roman era. And then later, a bigger kingdom was pulled together under Decibel.
But this Dacian power, it didn't stand for long against Rome, did it?
No. According to the material, that period under Decibel, the larger kingdom, it was actually quite brief. Maybe only about 2 decades before Roman expansion really hit its stride.
Okay, and here's where the history just takes this massive turn, right? The Romans arrive, Emperor Trajan conquers Dacia around 106 AD, makes it a Roman province, and this lasts until, 270, 275 AD?
Yeah, around then. And a key insight from the sources about this time is the really intense Romanization of Dacia, sometimes called Romanism. It involved a lot of settlement by people of Latin origin.
So the Danube became a secure frontier, cities flourished. The material uses this great image calling Dacia a melting pot, peoples, languages, ideas. Roman culture really bloomed there for a bit.
But then came the withdrawal. And the sources note that after the legions left, well, many cities fell into decline. Much of that visible Roman culture seemed to just fade away, leaving only traces like, early monasteries, and this striking phrase the source uses, a mere handful of uncast persons.
Uncast persons. What do you think that implies?
Well, it suggests maybe a small group left behind, perhaps not fully integrated or distinct from the groups that came later. It really highlights the disruption when Rome pulled out.
And that disruption just opened the floodgates for new groups arriving.
Absolutely. The sources describe these successive waves, barbarian invasions, with some really vivid language, almost poetic analogies, like groups arriving like the toes of a lobster or being carried on island-like castles. And it really suggests these powerful, distinct, maybe overwhelming forces moving in.
So despite this apparent decline and all these new invasions, the sources argue that something Roman actually stuck around.
Yes, they use this term Romanize Simplify. It's used to describe how a new nation, Basically, the foundation for the Romanians arose from this mix. It wasn't, full continuation of Roman high culture, but a fundamental cultural and linguistic root definitely remained and adapted.
That resilience is fascinating. The sources also touch on the earliest written languages around, then Greek, Latin dialects, and then later Slavic influences creeping in, seen in things like a Slavic Russian Bible mentioned.
Right. So moving into the Middle Ages, the picture isn't one single unified Romanian state, but the identity of the Romanian people themselves that's clearly noted by others.
How do we know that from the material? What does it say?
Well, the material highlights mentions from, say, Hungarian chroniclers, church officials, as early as the 10th, 13th centuries. They're specifically referring to Romanians living in Transylvania.
And the name Vlachs. That comes up a lot for this period, doesn't it?
It does. Greeks and Serbs used Vlachs for people in the southern Carpathians and Transylvania. But the material does point out it could sometimes be used, in a negative or derogatory way.
And each of those historical provinces, Wallachia, Moldavia, Transylvania, they also had different names used by outsiders, right?
Correct. Names used by peoples from the East, the Orient. Wallachia itself, it's first mentioned by a Byzantine historian in 1310.
And the Vlachs, they're described as emerging as pastoral folk, mainly in the southern Carpathians.
Around the 12th century, yeah. Then gradually moving down into the plains, expanding north into Moldavia and Transylvania by the 13th century. They even made raids against the Kingdom of Hungary.
And this period throws up a really interesting figure mentioned in the sources, John Hunyadi.
Yeah, he's described in this intriguing way, a peasant who turned into a king. His actions, taking mountain passes, fortifying places like Deva and Alba Iulia, which was an old Roman site,
Yeah.
it really highlights the kind of fluid social situation and the constant struggle to defend territory in these really turbulent times.
So out of this medieval mix, distinct political entities start to really take shape.
Yes, the principalities of Wallachia, set up around 1290, and Moldavia around 1359. They become, actual political units you can point to.
But they immediately face pressure from, well, pretty much everyone.
Constant pressure. The sources just list these waves of invasions: Avars, Slavs, Hungarians, Mongols, Turks. It's this recurring theme, isn't it? Always having to navigate powerful neighbors.
And by the 15th century, this pressure leads them to become tributary principalities.
Under the Ottoman Empire, yeah. Wallachia accepted that status in 1417. Moldavia followed in 1456. And meanwhile, Transylvania, that eventually came under Austrian rule.
What did being a tributary actually mean for their internal governance? Could they still run things themselves?
The source explains it was a complex balance. The local nobles, the boyars, they chose the princes, but the appointment had to be ratified, installed by the Ottoman sultans, and the sultans exercised authority through governors. However, the boyars did manage to hang on to significant internal rights.
So a kind of layered, often tense relationship with the Ottomans.
Exactly. But the sources also note that this internal sovereignty got even more limited later on, in the 17th century.
And we see examples of external influence beyond just the Ottomans too, right?
Oh yeah, like Polish protection over parts of Moldavia against the Turks, which actually led to establishing Catholic uniates there. Wallachia's use of the Danube, strategically vital, that's mentioned, and the region of Oltenia falling under direct Ottoman control for a time.
And Wallachia itself saw shifts in who held power internally.
Definitely. After it was liberated from direct Ottoman control, it went through these phases: vassalage, then more autonomy, and the material points out that the native aristocracy actually managed to claw back more power and rights, pushing against foreign advisors.
The economic impact of all this external control must have been huge.
Oh, profound. The sources give some really stark details. It notes that a third of Moldavia's landowners were Greek. And even more striking, in Wallachia, land ownership was almost entirely lost to foreigners.
Yeah.
Only 2 native families kept significant holdings. It just vividly shows the economic fallout of foreign dominance.
And just holding on to any kind of autonomy meant constant, complex maneuvering internationally.
Always. That struggle against Ottoman influence led to this really fragile balance of power, often maintained by, leaning on other foreign powers as suzerains for decades. The Phanariates, this Levantine aristocracy they're mentioned, is playing a role in influencing who became prince, sometimes manipulated by Romanian noble families themselves. It's just a picture of perpetual external entanglement.
But despite all these external pressures and no single unified state, Romanian culture kept developing, didn't it?
Yes, the sources really emphasize that. It grew from that core Daco-Roman population interacting with later influences, especially the Slavs.
And the language itself changed and evolved.
The Romanian language specialized. It sort of reorganized but kept its Latin spirit. And this gave rise to a really distinct Latin-based popular culture, very rich in folklore.
And the principalities themselves were crucial for written culture taking root.
Absolutely. They provided the framework. We find some fascinating examples in the sources, like the first known Romanian document from 1263. It was a trading certificate written in Cyrillic script.
Cyrillic initially, then, reflecting that Slavic influence.
Yes, the oldest writing in the Romanian language itself dates later, 1510, an act ordered by Prince Neago Basarab. But writing also appeared using the Greek alphabet, which the sources call an alphabet of living culture, and lots of Greek texts got translated.
It really points to that blend of influences converging in the region.
It really does. And just a practical need for official documents led to institutional changes. You see notarial institutions popping up, shifting from an Eastern model towards something more suited for a modernizing bureaucratic state that was slowly developing.
And the kinds of things being written expanded over time.
Yeah, from mostly religious, political, or liturgical stuff initially, it grew to include judicial acts, commercial contracts, and then eventually educational, literary, and historical works.
The sources even pinpoint what's considered the first Romanian document with a purely political aim.
A letter of donation from Radu Negru, Lord of Wallachia, dated May 20, 1392, drawn up in Slavo-Romanian. So these early documents, they show the principalities actively trying to define themselves and their place.
Okay, this brings us neatly into the 19th century, a period marked by this powerful new force, nationalism, and Romania starting to emerge as what the sources call a young state.
Yeah, the sources really highlight this as a pivotal moment. It involved huge territorial changes and this massive challenge of uniting different regions that had all been under various kinds of political dependence for so long.
The unification of the Romanian principalities, Moldavia and Wallachia, is presented as this landmark historic act.
It's definitely framed as the crucial first step towards a modern Romanian state, consolidating national unity. The sources describe it as this centuries-long dream, almost a natural course for the people of Moldavia and Wallachia who shared so much history and language.
And Moldavian leaders were thinking about this surprisingly early on.
As early as the 15th century, believe it or not, according to the material.
But those external empires constantly got in the way.
Always. The Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian empires, frequently stepping in, obstructing any path towards unification.
Yet the desire persisted.
It really did. You see the principalities challenging the Turks, looking for Russian help. The election of Cuza as prince of both Moldavia and Wallachia was this critical step, a de facto union.
But even that faced pushback.
Oh yeah, from the Turks and Austrians. And the sources note that Russia, even though it had a protectorate, was kind of worried that a united Romania might mess up its broader plans in the Balkans, regarding Slavic and Orthodox populations.
This period just really underlines how the fate of this region was constantly tangled up with the interests of bigger powers. The sources also point out that while nationalism was driving things, Romania wasn't really a player internationally yet, though diplomatic efforts did start picking up after Turkey recognized its status in 1879.
Right. And alongside these political moves towards statehood, the 19th century also saw this major cultural blossoming.
The sources describe an inconceivable alertness in Romanian culture around the mid-1800s.
Yeah, this cultural renaissance, it included big developments in theater, from trying to bring in Italian styles to the very first plays written and performed in Romania. Patriotic themes were huge, and permanent theaters were established.
And the 1890s saw a boom in journalism.
Definitely. Key newspapers like Adevărul, Truth, Romania, Dimineața, Morning were founded. The sources describe the press then as a reliable transmission belt of culture, really crucial for spreading ideas and national consciousness.
And cultural sovereignty was pursued through these big gestures and institutions, too.
Like hosting the first international exposition in Bucharest, building the Central National University Library. Education reforms pushed for modern schools, and having a national theater was seen as this really important symbol of national identity. This cultural and political energy leads us right into World War I.
A global conflict that presented this dramatic chance to finally achieve the dream of Great Romania, especially hoped for by Romanians in Transylvania and Bessarabia wanting to escape foreign rule.
Right. Romania initially stayed neutral in 1914. The material notes public opinion was pretty mixed, some pro-Austro-German sentiment, considerable pro-Russian feelings too. So conflicting pressures on the government caught between staying neutral and this goal of unification.
But Romania eventually entered the war on the side of the Entente in August 1916.
And the sources are pretty clear the main driver was that national ideal, unification.
Things didn't exactly go smoothly at first, though.
No. Despite some initial successes pushing into Transylvania, counteroffensives and failures by allies meant a lot of Romanian territory got overrun and occupied by early 1917. The sources note this came at a really heavy cost, both military and civilian lives.
The peace treaty that followed, the Peace of Bucharest, is described as historically harsh.
Yeah, it left the country invaded, occupied, exploited. Although, interestingly, its oil reserves couldn't be fully exploited by the occupiers.
But the tide of the war eventually turned.
Allied victories on the Western Front in late 1918 changed everything. Romania jumped back into the conflict, the army advanced into Transylvania, and the material says they were met with joy.
And the pivotal moment, obviously, is the Great Union of 1918.
This was it. The unification of Transylvania, Bessarabia, and Bukovina with the existing kingdom. These were lands mostly held by Austria-Hungary before, or annexed by Russia.
The sources emphasize the resolutions of Alba Iulia as being key to making this happen.
They do. They highlight the role played by political representatives, priests too, in that formal congress at Alba Iulia, noting that the military wasn't formally part of that specific assembly, which is interesting.
Allied support was crucial to actually hold on to these gains, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The sources indicate support against Hungarian and Soviet challenges was vital. And the 1920 treaty, backed by military intervention, basically set the borders and became the foundation for organizing what became known as Greater Romania. So the immediate result of WWI and the Union was finally achieving that long-held national dream.
And this just significantly changed Romania's position in Eastern Europe.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
The country's territory and population basically doubled overnight, from about 7.7 million to 15.7 million people.
The economic potential must have grown massively, too.
Yeah, the gross national product doubled. Even though the war itself had a huge negative economic impact, and the human cost was enormous, millions affected, significant casualties.
Greater Romania was now fundamentally a multinational state.
Definitely. Home not just to Romanians, but large populations of Hungarians, Ruthenians, Germans, Jews, Bulgarians, Russians, Serbs.
Integrating all these diverse regions must have been a monumental challenge.
Oh, immense. The sources highlight the need for huge infrastructure projects, like adding 3,200 kilometers of railway, just to connect these previously separate economic regions and update old systems inherited from different empires.
And the material doesn't sugarcoat the difficulties of this integration.
No, it describes the shock and the challenges. Borders were new, sometimes contested, old trade routes were cut off. The new kingdom could feel isolated, described sometimes as landlocked, poor, still reeling from the war.
State institutions had to be stretched rapidly across the new territories.
Yeah, annexing administrative systems, education, everything to the central state, which meant creating a whole new generation of civil servants really quickly.
And the very idea of Great Romania was intensely debated at the time.
It was a major theme, in literature and journalism. And the sources even list that rapid-fire succession of Union proclamations from different regions in late 1918 Transylvania, then Cluj, Banat, Maramureş, northern Bukovina, all within days of each other in December.
And importantly, the sources contain a very critical perspective on this period as well, which we need to acknowledge.
Yes, they mention competing errors in the post-Union state. Specifically, this intense focus on just claiming the acquired territories and, using the source's strong words, a systematic erasure of history and national pride. The material links this to what it calls the bloodiest draconian rule, and claims a high death toll among non-Romanians after 1918. This viewpoint from the source really highlights the deep sensitivities and significant conflicts that came with this rapid, complex process of building a unified state from such diverse parts. So, yeah, the interwar period was really shaped by those challenges of consolidating Greater Romania, dealing with that multinational reality and all the tensions that came with it.
The sources note political and administrative changes followed treaties like Trianon. And while there was a single parliament, a constitution, principles of autonomy were apparently sometimes ignored, which fueled social friction.
And that's the context for that stark claim from the source we just mentioned about competing errors and the alleged systematic erasure and its tragic consequences for non-Romanian groups. It reveals these deep wounds from that period of rapid, maybe forced integration.
And while the sources don't go deep into interwar economics specifically, the impact of WWI, those cut trade routes, the description of the kingdom being core, it all points to massive economic hurdles in trying to integrate these very different war-torn regions.
Right. Moving forward chronologically then, The whole geopolitical scene shifts dramatically by 1939, especially with the German-Soviet non-aggression pact.
Yeah, that pact immediately put Romania's borders under threat. The sources point out Romania lost northern Dobruja in 1940 and faced pressure from Hungary and Germany wanting to revise the Trianon Treaty regarding southern Transylvania.
And critically, June 28, 1940, the USSR delivers an ultimatum. Soviet forces move into Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. The material states Romania condemned this as an international crime.
So despite trying for neutrality, all this pressure and territorial loss basically pushed Romania towards aligning with the Axis powers at the start of WWII. The sources state its entry into the war against the Soviets was based on these really complex political calculations.
Yeah, the material mentions the attack on Romanian troops at the Prut River, June 22, 1941.
And Romania played a significant and ultimately tragic role in the war.
Particularly because of its huge energy resources. The sources state Romania supplied something like 2/3 of Germany's oil, plus significant gas. That made it a crucial target for the Allies.
So Allied air power went after these resources.
Yes, with successful bombing raids on oil wells, although the processing plants were apparently harder to destroy. The U.S. specifically focused air power on the Ploiesti refineries in June 1944.
But despite its initial alliance, the sources also mention Romania later making significant contributions to the Allied cause.
Yeah, participating in military actions in the rear of the Axis powers, interestingly.
The tide of the war changed hugely after the German defeat at Stalingrad.
Right, making it pretty clear, according to the sources, that Romania was directly in the path of the next major Soviet offensive.
Which leads to that pivotal moment, the August 23rd, 1944 coup d'etat.
Yeah, the sources describe this as a clear, unambiguous act by Romania to switch sides and throw its support behind the Allied cause, the UN cause as it's put.
However, this period of war and shifting alliances also includes one of the darkest points highlighted in the material.
Yes. Later sections explicitly state that the regime of that time misused the idea of national unity and, in the source's words, ferociously exterminated the Jewish and Roma population during the Second World War. The sources make this devastating claim that, in this respect, the regime was comparable to formerly existing empires. This is a crucial and deeply tragic aspect of Romania's WWII history presented in the material, and we have to report it as such.
Right. So, following World War II, Romania's fate was just fundamentally altered. It fell under Soviet influence, what the sources directly call Soviet imperialism.
Yeah. The material touches briefly on the political instability just before that. In the late 30s, infighting, corruption leading to power shifting towards fascist dictatorships like the Iron Guard and Marshal Antonescu. This happened after, in the source's framing, Romania was significantly weakened by those Soviet actions in June 1940, losing Bessarabia and northern Bukovina.
And even under communism, those ethnic tensions didn't just disappear.
No. The sources mention a Hungarian group trying to enter Romania in 1956, apparently backed by the Hungarian state, pushing for language rights for the Hungarian minority in Transylvania. It just highlights these ongoing issues bubbling beneath the surface.
The communist period itself, particularly under Nicolas Ceausescu, is described in really harsh terms in the material.
Oh, yeah. It calls it a tyrannical regime, characterized by terror at home, self-isolation politically, diverging from Moscow and being brutally invasive in people's lives through pervasive control.
Yet, the sources point out this strange contradiction, don't they?
They do. Despite all that internal repression, Ceausescu actually got international praise, especially when he adopted a more independent foreign policy. Earned him these propaganda titles like Most Beloved Daughter, Genius of the Carpathians. It really shows the massive disconnect between the image and the reality of his rule.
The period from 1970 to 1989 saw analyses focusing on his unique politics and foreign policy.
Highlighting, as the sources put it, his personal asset agility and this drive for preeminent status.
The sources also include this very peculiar detail about Ceausescu's image. It's quite strange.
It is. It questions his choice of photos with figures like bin Laden, Bush, Milosevic, noting their eventual fates and sort of musing on why he chose those photos. Was it about prisons, fame, leadership against terrorism? It's a weird, specific observation from the source, giving a glimpse into how his image was maybe constructed or perceived.
Now, the sources we have don't go into massive detail about the communist economy itself.
No, but the lead-in to the later post-communist reforms definitely implies a system with a very high degree of state control over property, referred to as socialist property.
Which brings us to the dramatic events of 1989.
Right. The year the communist regimes collapsed across Eastern Europe, and Romania was absolutely part of that wave.
But Romania's revolution was tragically different, wasn't it?
Yes. The sources describe it having this violent aura, marked by really brutal repression from the regime, unlike the more peaceful velvet transitions in many other places.
The swift public execution of Ceausescu and his wife on December 26, 1989, is highlighted.
Yeah, that event, broadcast around the world, is described as creating the first serious panic in a part of the communist world.
And the material makes a very strong statement about the nature of the uprising there.
It says Romania was the only country where the regime actively and brutally fought back against the popular movements, leading to a significantly higher death toll, which the sources attribute to internal and external reaction.
What fueled this violent explosion?
Well, deep-seated frustrations,
Yeah.
social, economic, political, cultural, coupled with this widespread feeling that the government was just incapable of modernizing or improving people's lives.
And the bigger picture, the changes across Eastern Europe, that played a role too.
Oh, absolutely. The spread of democracy and freedom next door, the weakening Soviet Union, it all put pressure on the Romanian regime. The material points to the church and student movements as being really fundamental in the regime's fall.
Key events in late '89 are described as tumults.
Yeah, they started taking lives and just quickly escalated into widespread violence.
Timisoara is highlighted as a real flashpoint city.
Many people died there, killed by the securite, the secret police. The regime tried to hush it up, terrified the protests would spread. The sources suggest the violence wasn't inevitable, but resulted from this peculiar interaction of contingency factors that sort of favored extremist tactics.
There were efforts to stop the bloodshed, though.
Figures like Ion Iliescu are mentioned as trying to intervene.
But the immediate aftermath was just chaos.
Yeah, the sources note these defense networks forming, broadcasters being attacked, even existing knowledge from the old militia being used. It suggests remnants of the old regime's methods were still active amidst the turmoil.
Rules for behavior were apparently written down in 1990, but not really followed.
No. Which led to continued disorganization, uncertainty, which, according to the sources, actually helped the remnants of the old regime consolidate power again.
This period of reckoning with the past sounds incredibly intense.
Yeah, the material talks about a mass cataloging of the past, a sense of national penitence. Social scientists, according to the source, explain this partly as a psychological tendency to find blame outside oneself, but also an ideological interest in, national sustainability and just trying to understand the mess of the transition.
Right, so the period after 1989 is defined by this profound, rapid, radical transformation across everything.
Political system, economic system, social values, everything changed. A new democratic regime was set up, competitive parties, free elections, human rights, freedoms. Although the sources offer a critical view here too, stating that genuine democracy could not be set at the end of the first decade. Partly because parties struggled to gain trust, couldn't solve key issues. The political structure was still seen as unstable, questioned.
And the path wasn't exactly smooth.
No. One source paraphrased here describes the political transitions as extremely sinuous, noting this persistent influence of old communist elements and different ways people interpreted what actually happened in '89. This tension boiled over in the early 2010s, big protests against corruption, economic problems, leading to political crises like that July 2012 destitution or coup attempt. The sources say that had really terrifying national and international repercussions.
Economic reforms were announced quickly, though, aiming for a market economy, privatization.
Yeah, promises were made about state resources covering pensions, salaries, allowing investments, focus on housing projects.
But actually doing it ran into problems.
The sources blame initial enthusiasm and obscurity. Political obstacles were huge, partly because, the opposition could remind people of perceived good things about the old economic system.
And the sources offer a very sharp critique of how this economic transition actually played out.
Oh, yeah. They describe the economy itself as leaderless and disorganized, lacking any clear vision for reform.
And the privatization process comes in for particularly harsh criticism.
Hundreds of state companies sold off piecemeal for very low prices. This process, according to the sources, led to just immense losses of capital, wealth, jobs.
There's that really strong claim about privatizing industries and banks.
Yes. The sources give a specific example. A bank sold for $120 million that allegedly turned a $500 million profit in just 1 year. They suggest this whole approach was used to basically buy up industries cheaply and prevent proper market adjustments, mainly benefiting private and foreign interests. The strong language used states this led to billions of dollars losses and, in the source's view, helped condemn the nation to poverty. Agriculture is also described as unproductive.
and undeveloped. The sources expressed this frustration that efforts seemed focused on just creating new entities rather than effectively privatizing and getting revenue, suggesting a focus on personal gain, packing the coffers, as they put it. And meeting the economic standards needed for European integration was obviously made much harder by all this chaotic transition.
Yeah, the sources mention uncontrolled decentralization, and these existing power structures focused on self-enrichment as major roadblocks to making the necessary reforms.
Right. But this whole chaotic transition period was framed by this powerful external goal: integration into Europe, into Euro-Atlantic structures,
Driven by studying Western models, aiming for alignment.
and joining key organizations like NATO and the European Union became these landmark events.
NATO membership seen as crucial for security, protecting territory.
And EU membership seen as promoting democracy, political stability, driving economic reform.
And this was a stated priority in Romania's foreign policy right from the early 1990s.
Yes, alongside building deep strategic ties with the USA. Romania applied for both EU and NATO membership at the same time in 1995.
And writing in the late 90s, early 2000s, the sources expressed quite a bit of hope for Romania's future role.
Yeah, as an active EU and Euro-Atlantic player, contributing to regional global security, expecting military contributions, adaptation to European standards for borders, systems. There are specific details mentioned about the preparations for integration, too.
Like getting ready for visa liberalization, adapting laws, government actions, and evaluations of border control performance in the early 2000s, seen as guarantees needed for integration.
The whole narrative kind of frames Romania's journey as joining the club of European nations later than many founding members.
Right, developing a more Western-oriented political sense, national identity, with this consciousness of needing to catch up with Western European values after those decades of being separate.
So wow, we have taken quite a sweeping journey through Romania's history.
We really have. From those ancient peoples and the enduring legacy of Romanization, through the principalities constantly fighting for survival under these huge empires, to that complex, turbulent path to modern statehood, and finally unification in the early 20th century.
We covered the devastating impacts of 2 world wars, including that really stark account in the sources about the wartime extermination of Jewish and Roma populations.
And explored the decades under that unique, highly repressive communist regime, followed by the incredibly rapid and often painful transition, and that determined push towards European integration after 1989.
We've definitely seen a nation shaped by its unique geography right at a European crossroads, grappling with its identity amidst all these diverse influences, facing just relentless external pressures.
Yeah, the sources reveal this really complex past, marked by moments of cultural flourishing, national unity, sure, but also these long periods of invasion, occupation, losing territory, intense internal conflict, including those stark details about political repression, ethnic tensions, and the highly criticized economic reforms post-communism.
Romania's emergence as an independent state is described in the material as, well, pretty unique in the Balkans, rare in Europe even. Achieved despite incredibly tough conditions, mistrust among neighbors. It's even positioned by the sources as a kind of rampart against Slavic expansionist movements on Europe's eastern flank.
It really is a history of resilience, of struggle, and just ongoing transformation.
So considering this huge sweep of history, the constant pressure from outside powers, the internal complexities of being a multinational state going through rapid change, those turbulent shifts between different global blocs, here's a final thought, something for you, our listeners, to consider. How do you think these deep historical legacies, this centuries-long experience of navigating external dominance and internal division, continue to shape Romania's sense of identity and its strategic role within the dynamics of Europe today?